Hey everybody, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Still a 2019 reInvent. Really excited to be here. We have an awesome host here, and we're really excited to talk about data exchange. So my name is Alejandra. I am currently working in AWS Developer Relations, and I'll let some of my other folks here on stage go ahead and introduce themselves.
Sure. Good afternoon, Las Vegas. My name's Chris Casey. I look after business development for AWS Data Exchange, and prior to joining AWS, I led a few different data businesses for a category-leading financial services data company that provides various types of financial data to banks and asset managers around the world. Noah?
Good afternoon, Twitch, and everyone here at AWS reInvent. My name is Noah Schwartz. I look after engineering for AWS Data Exchange. And prior to taking this role here at AWS, I led a number of engineering teams that produced and used data in the sports, retail, and financial services industries.
And once again, I'm Matt Fitzgerald, Head of Developer Relations, Asia Pacific, China, and Japan. And this is a big crowd up here, and I feel like I'm being nudged off the end, so I'm going to be muscling my way. All right.
And Craig.
Good afternoon, AWS reInvent. I'm Craig Denton, Chief Data Officer at Enigma. Enigma is trying to build the most reliable source of information about US businesses. And in doing so, we collect a massive amount of public records. And as part of this, we were one of the first data providers on the AWS Data Exchange. And so today, I'm excited to demo one of our free data products that you can subscribe to today.
Awesome. So first off, let's get started with the first question. What is AWS Exchange?
Cool. AWS Data Exchange is a new service we recently launched on November 13th this year. And the service is designed to make it really easy for AWS customers to securely find, subscribe to, and use data in the AWS cloud. And the service is really designed to remove friction for exchanging data from two different types of customers, data providers and data subscribers.
So interesting. So tell me, what is the distinction between data providers and data subscribers important? What is the challenge that this service will be solving for data providers?
Yeah. So the distinction's important because some of the benefits of the service, or the main benefits of the service, differ slightly depending on the type of customer you're talking about. So data providers, we have data providers on AWS Data Exchange today that have been providing data for a long time. Companies like Pitney Bowes, Reuters, Experian, Change Healthcare, and emerging companies like Crux, TrueFactor, and Enigma, who we have on stage with us today. These companies, like many others, get into the business of providing data because they really believe that the data they have might be valuable to other third parties, or as we call them on AWS Data Exchange, data subscribers. And there's some real commonalities in the challenges when you talk to these companies, that it's really hard for them to build metering, billing, entitlement, and data distribution technology at scale. And they all have to do it no matter the size of the organization they are. If you get really good at it for one type of data, the challenge is you have to keep evolving that technology to keep up with your customer demand. And many of the customers we talked to really saw that and those functions as some undifferentiated heavy lifting that used up some of their precious technical resources that they'd much rather be deploying on improving the quality and comprehensiveness of their data offerings. With AWS Data Exchange, the service handles the heavy lifting associated with metering, billing, entitling, and ultimately distributing your data, and it does it in an AWS native way.
What is the format of the data that we're able to exchange? Can we deal with, say, like RDF data if we're looking at graph databases? Obviously, there's relational data. What is the typical format that customers are going to be working with?
Sure, yeah, it varies by the provider, so it's up to the provider how they want to specify their formats of data. And the service today supports any file format that S3 supports, so objects in S3 can be rendered by any of the providers in the AWS Data Exchange today.
Okay, so you're effectively format agnostic in that regards. You just facilitate the exchange.
The way we think about it is we don't really take an opinion on the format of the data. Our data providers are the experts, the best way to consume their data, so that's on them. We try to make it easy for them to distribute their data to all of their customers.
Noah, do you want to talk about subscribers?
Sure, yeah. So you wouldn't have data providers if you didn't also have customers subscribing to their data. Everyone uses data to solve problems, whether you're running a business, building an application, or answering an important question. You could be an NFL team preparing for the draft, so you're looking at college player statistics. You might be a research institution trying to cure a disease, or you could be a parts manufacturer optimizing your supply chain. Now the problem is that every data provider distributes their data differently. So as you subscribe to more and more data, you're inventing very similar looking solutions to consume that data and get it into a place where you can do something meaningful with it. Some data providers will distribute their data using a bespoke API, some will use FTP, and some will even ship you physical media in the mail. So in this best case scenario, you're coding to a bespoke API, and that's something you have to manage. Maybe you're dealing with FTP credentials, you have to need a way to do that securely. And that worst case scenario, you're actually waiting days or even weeks for data to arrive in the mail. That's a real distraction if your goal is to cure a disease or build a better car. With AWS Data Exchange, you're able to get access to all of your data using a single API, and that API makes it really easy to get your data into a service like Amazon S3. And then from there, you can use our suite of analytics and machine learning services to do something meaningful with your data. For example, you can point Redshift at your data in Amazon S3, and you can get started building a data lake. You could use Amazon SageMaker, that's our fully managed machine learning service, to draw inference from your data. Or you could query your data without having to set up any infrastructure using Amazon Athena, which we'll actually see later in the session.
So prior to your roles building this service, you both had roles where you were both providers and subscribers of data, right? Have you given any thought to what you would have done differently in those roles if this service existed?
Yeah, I can certainly go first. So when you're running a data business, you're constantly looking for new ways to release new data offerings as fast as you possibly can. And once you release them, you want to make them available to as many subscribers as you possibly can. The way we handled it in my prior role, we would spin up a bespoke project to define the data that we wanted to provide, the coverage, for example, the S&P 500. We would define the marketing materials, the pricing, the subscription terms, and then ultimately hand all of those different parameters off to different engineering teams as requirements, where they would have to go off and build all those things in isolation. With AWS Data Exchange, many of those building blocks talked about are simple configurations on the AWS console. And better yet, once you actually publish your product into the AWS Data Exchange, your data is almost instantaneously discoverable and subscribable to millions of AWS customers via the AWS Marketplace. So if AWS Data Exchange was in existence when I was in my prior role, I truly believe the service would not only reduce our time to market with data offerings, but also our time to sale for new and existing data offerings.
So we do actually have a question from the Twitch chat.
Cool.
Nandiki Shoraz is wondering, how does the data security work with data providers and subscribers? Do they typically have accounts created with a user ID and password, or do we have to use AWS Secret Service to store it?
You want to take that?
Yeah, I'm hoping I'm understanding the question correctly. The way a subscriber accesses their data is the way you would use any other AWS service. We have an SDK that makes it really easy for you to access your data. The data is stored in AWS Data Exchange, and we have APIs that allow you to take the data out of Data Exchange into Amazon S3. We also have APIs that allow you to download that data directly if you want to use it on-prem or outside of AWS.
So Noah, can you tell us a little bit about the 3 layers that you have to think about when you're subscribing to data?
Sure, yeah. So there's really at least 3 layers when you're subscribing to data. The first layer is you're trying to find and then pay for the data that you need. Then in that second layer, you're trying to get the data into a place where you can do something meaningful or useful with it. Then that third layer, which is really where you want to spend most of your time, that's when you're doing something valuable with your data. That's when you're building a business, building an application, or answering an important question. In my own experience, I've spent entirely too much time in that second layer. We talked earlier about some of the ways that data providers distribute data today. At best, you have a bespoke API that you're coding to, and that's something you now have to maintain. Behind that, you have FTP credentials, which you need to manage securely. You're polling for updates at certain times. You may miss an update. And then that worst case scenario, you're actually waiting for data to arrive in a box. It's kind of hard not to question why it works that way when you're able to spin up thousands of instances using a service like Amazon EC2, or go completely serverless and never have to manage an instance or a cluster using AWS Lambda. So with AWS Data Exchange, I'm able to access all of my data under a single API. I'm able to use that API to get the data into Amazon S3. And then actually, we send a CloudWatch event when new data is published. So I can set up automation so that as new data comes in, my CloudWatch event picks it up and automatically exports it to S3 for me. So I can really just set it once and never have to think about it again. And then I can spend the majority of my time in that third layer where I'm using other analytics and machine learning services against my data to draw meaningful value from it. And we'll actually see later today, I'll use Amazon Athena to do that live.
So just before you get into your demo, when you actually broker these data sets, Is there some metadata that describes the data so that the consumer of it or the subscriber knows what version of the data set, if the schema of the underlying data has changed? I know you said you leave it up to the producer to effectively, or the publisher to define that, but obviously the subscriber needs to know what they're getting, right? So do you provide some tooling around that?
Yeah, so that's still a relationship that's managed between the subscriber and the provider, and the reasoning is pretty much what I said earlier. The provider has the best idea on the way for their data to be consumed, and when a subscriber subscribes to data, they're meant to understand how the data is formatted and how to best use it. We have heard from customers that there's more that we can do there, and of course we always do what our customers tell us, what we hear is most important. So as we continue to get feedback like that, that's where you can expect us to invest our own time.
So Craig, I know that Enigma has been delivering data to its customers for a while now. What made you choose to start using AWS Data Exchange?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So Enigma's core business is to build this intelligence asset on businesses in the US, but underlying that are millions of public records. And actually, when we first started the company, our first product was called Enigma Public, and it was a search and discovery platform for this type of data. But in order to access that data, it would be coding against a custom API, just as Noah mentioned. And so when we met the AWS Data Exchange team, we realized that our mission to kind of give all of that public record back to our community was actually very aligned with theirs. And so we started by publishing our top 25 products that were most popular, with the hope that enterprises, data scientists, academics would kind of follow in our footsteps and either build a project or a whole company on this type of data. So in short, the Data Exchange is really providing us the tools to distribute this data to millions of AWS customers really seamlessly.
So Chris, this service sounds pretty good for new data subscribers, but would this service still be useful for customers that already have subscriptions to data today?
Yeah, you should read more about it on the website. We've got a lot more details there. But the service allows data providers and data subscribers to migrate existing data subscriptions they have to AWS Data Exchange for no additional cost to either party. So if you have an existing subscription to third-party data and you'd rather get that data via AWS Data Exchange, just direct the data provider to our registration page and our team will help onboard them to the service.
And do you support any region? Sorry, Alejandro. No, that's totally fine. This is sort of in response to a question that's popped up.
Yeah.
So what regions is Data Exchange supported in today?
Sure, so the data catalog can be reached from any region. That's a global catalog. And then Data Exchange itself, which is where you go to publish and then get your data, is available in 11 regions, and you can find those regions on our website. Obviously, region expansion is important for every AWS service, so as we continue to hear from customers the regions where they want our service, you can expect that we'll deploy our service there.
So I think we're running short on time, so we probably want to go ahead and skip to the demo. What do you think?
Yeah.
Sounds
All
good.
right.
Yep. Sounds good. So you're now looking at my screen. This is the AWS Data Exchange console, and you can actually see a list of all the products here. We're going to be working with the SEC private fundraising data set today, and I'll explain a little bit more about that data in a second. So the Data Exchange actually organizes your data into data sets. So you can actually see some of the metadata about this particular product below. But if we go to the Datasets tab, so every product has data sets, and if you update a data set, that's called a revision. So I actually updated this data set just yesterday. And so I'm going to show you how I did that right now. So as Noah mentioned earlier, a revision is comprised of any S3 object, and as those objects are uploaded, they become what we call assets. So let's add a comment here. We can call it, say, reinvent Twitch. We're going to create a new revision. And now we're going to import that from an Enigma S3 bucket. Okay, so now what's going on in the back end is a job is being created to actually take this data from an Enigma server and port it into the Data Exchange. So while this is running, I'll tell you a little bit about what's interesting about this data set in particular. So the Security Exchange Commission, actually every time a private company raises capital, so whether that's a hedge fund or startup, they have to register this fundraising event with the SEC. This data is generally published on a quarterly basis, but obviously you kind of want to get that data much more real time, say on a daily basis. And so Enigma actually parses the XML feed that's coming directly from the SEC and structures it into a historical data set that you can actually use straight off the shelf to do any type of analysis you want. So now you can see that this job is actually finished running. We're going to finalize that revision, which means it's being provisioned for actually distribution to our customers. And then we can actually add it to this existing product and hit publish, and there we go. We've actually published a new data set.
You know, that console experience was pretty fast and straightforward, so that's pretty cool. Does AWS Data Exchange have any APIs to replicate what you just did with all those files?
It does. So just like every other AWS service, if you've coded against those, you'll find this really easy to code against as well. We actually use the APIs to programmatically update each of our data sets automatically as the data comes into our databases.
Wow, cool. Noah, can you walk us through the experience on the subscriber side of things?
Yeah, absolutely. Just going to wait for the screen to switch before I get started here.
And it looks like we still have a few minutes left, so this will
Just
probably be the last
right.
one.
All right, here we go.
Oh, it's done now. I'm just
wonderful.
going to get this in quick.
So in this scenario, I want you to imagine, I want you to imagine that I run a small startup and I'm looking to get an answer to the best time of the year for me to raise my Series A. So what I'm going to do is I have a subscription to Craig's dataset, FormD, and as he said, it's 6 years of history and it's updated daily. So I'm going to export that from Data Exchange into S3, and then I'm going to point Athena at my S3 bucket, and then I'm going to be able to figure out in which quarter I should raise my Series A. So starting things off, I'm going to look at a list of the data sets that I'm entitled to. And for those of you that were asking live on the Twitch session, you can see here that I'm doing this using our APIs, and I'll never have to leave AWS to answer my question. Everything starts in AWS and will end in AWS. So I see at the bottom here I have access to the FormD data set that Craig was talking about earlier. The next thing I need to do is I need to ask Data Exchange, what's the latest revision for this data set? So in my next tab, again, I'm going to use the SDK. I'm going to list the revisions. Craig mentioned that he'd previously uploaded a new revision. I see that here. It's the reInvent Twitch revision. So my next step is going to be to ask Data Exchange what the assets are in that revision. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow me to tell Data Exchange, take my data out of Data Exchange, put it into S3, and then I'll use Athena to figure out in which quarter to raise Series A. So I have a list of my assets here. The file looks correct. And then my next step, the way you get data in and the way you get data out is through what we call a job. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to get the job started. But before I do that, I just want to call out that I'm putting it into my S3 bucket. So Data Exchange is putting it into my own S3 bucket. So I'm going to create my job. And then I'm going to grab the job ID. I'm going to have Data Exchange start my job. And while that's running, I'm going to explain a little bit about what's going on. It's going back to providers for one moment. When a data provider is putting their data into Data Exchange, one of the massive benefits for them that Chris was mentioning earlier is that we handle distribution for them. So as data is put into the service, they don't need to worry about getting that out to all of their customers. That's something we do on their behalf. And that's really, you're seeing the mirror of that here for a subscriber. I'm asking Data Exchange for my data. The service is putting it into my S3 bucket for me, and then I know that it's my data, no one else will be able to touch it, and I can run my queries against it. So I'm going to ask Data Exchange to see if my job completed. I see here that it did. It's done. So just to confirm that everything is as it should be, I'm going to actually list my data in S3. And I see here that the data was updated just a few moments ago today. So now that I have my data in S3, I can point Amazon Athena at my data and run my query. So I'm running a query here. There's a lot of nuances. I'm going to gloss over some of that. But the point is, it's standard SQL syntax to create a table and query my data. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to create my table. And then in my next tab, I'm going to run a query that's going to group by quarter over the last 6 years of history, and take the average capital raised per round and sort it by quarter, which will tell me the best quarter to raise my Series A. So my last step here is I'm going to grab my query ID. Then in this next tab, I'm getting the results from Athena. I'm going to filter out some of the stuff that I don't want. It comes back in JSON, and I'm going to pretty print it as a CSV for those of you viewing so that you can see the answer. So very clearly here, I see that there's a trend where 27 million is raised on average in Q2. Then in Q3, Q1, and Q4, on average is 22 million. It's a very clear signal to me that I should raise my Series A in Q2. And just to tie this back to what we were saying earlier, because I think it's so important, I was really able to breeze through the process of getting access to data and put it into a place where I could do something meaningful with it. That might have taken days otherwise, but I was able to do it here live in minutes. And then I was able to really spend my time in that third layer using my data to answer a question. In this case, tell me when to raise my Series A.
All right, well, it looks like that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for that awesome demo. Thank you for showing us about the new feature, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Cheers.